So here's a bit of background. I work at the front desk of a hotel. I'm an anxious mess. I'm also kind of overly nice. I usually shy away from confrontation at all costs, which usually makes me so passive that I'll just go along with anything, even if I'm uncomfortable. At the front desk, we're pretty used to guys hitting on us, asking us what time we leave for work, and if we want to skinny dip with them in our pool. Well, it's a rare occasion, but we sometimes also get weird calls. I've had my fair share, but one in particular really stood out to me. Here's how the conversation went.
Thank you for calling. This is so-and-so. How can I help you?
Oh, that's pretty lame. I'm sure your boyfriend hates it.
I'm sorry?
I'm sure it gets a lot of conversation from the guys.
I mean, not really.
A beautiful name for a beautiful girl, right?
I mean, I guess.
So how'd you get that name anyways?
I don't know. I guess my dad liked it.
Oh, is he Native American?
No.
Is your mom?
No.
That's crazy. So you're not Native American? Do you have blonde hair?
No. Were you needing to make a reservation, or...?
Oh yes, you distracted me. What's the availability for this date?
We were pretty full that weekend from sports teams.
We're actually sold out that weekend. Are your dates available?
They are. What about this date?
We actually do have the availability. The rate is X amount.
Does that include the price of drinks for you and your boyfriend?
I'm sorry?
I want to take you and your boyfriend out to dinner.
Yeah, no thanks.
Come on, we're coming into town for a party. We want you guys to come. We're really a great group. I'm telling you, you'll have so much fun with us.
No thank you, we're not really party people.
Well, I'll be honest, it's not really a party. We're swingers.
Okay.
Have you ever been interested in being with another man and having your boyfriend watch?
What? No.
Wow, so he must be a 10 all around, huh?
Yep, he's pretty great. Perfect, actually.
So he is a 10?
Yep, absolutely.
So he's 10 inches?
Excuse me?
You said he's a 10 all around. That must mean he's 10 inches.
Literally, I was so shook that a stranger would actually ask me this during a first-time conversation that I literally didn't even know what to say. I also didn't even have a boyfriend at the time, but 10 inches? My soul itself couldn't handle the weight of that question. He could sense my shock.
I bet you're bright red right now.
I'm not. I mean, I'm black, so that's not even a thing that happens to us, but I don't think that's an appropriate question, and I'm going to have to hang up now.
Okay, well, my name is Joe. I'll call back soon.
No, that's okay, sir. I'd prefer if you didn't.
So yeah, that's my creepy caller story. Nothing else really happened beyond that, and I never heard back from Joe. But God, that was a really creepy phone call. I'm not really sure if this belongs here, but a couple of years ago when I was about 13 years old, I made a post on Craigslist advertising babysitting services as a way to make some extra money. The morning after I made the post, I had gotten a phone call from a man supposedly interested in hiring. As soon as I heard his voice, I got an anxious feeling. He was whispering/talking very low and kind of slow the entire time of the call. It was extremely off-putting, sounding like he was middle-aged. So we exchange hellos and he says what he's calling about, and asks what I'm charging, asks my name, age, other details, etc. So anyways, he says he has a young son for whom he needs a babysitter. Then he begins asking about my experience, and then strangely diving into overly lengthy descriptions of his own life. I don't really remember the details of the conversation, but I do remember one thing that he asked extremely clearly.
Now, look. Now, my son, well, he sometimes likes to touch himself. That wouldn't bother you, would it?
In his creepy, slow, low voice. I just remember being filled with anxiety at that and wanting to hang up immediately. It was just sort of beyond TMI. His voice and tone just really made it so much worse. He sounded serious, but at this point, I was just convinced it was some sort of a prank, and I was almost certain that he didn't even have a kid. I really had no idea how to respond to that, and even though this was on the phone, me being a stupid and at that point a petrified 13-year-old kid, I just responded with no. And I'm sure he realized just how nervous I sounded because he just kinda gave a low chuckle and continued on.
Because you know how little boys are.
Honestly, a lot of the details of that convo are blurred, and it actually went by fairly quickly. I just remember kind of nodding and just yesing my way to the end when he then asked my availability and said he would give a call back. He ended the call with,
"Okay, thanks."
and with a little chuckle, he hung up. I can't really remember whether he gave me his info or not, but I'm pretty sure he didn't call back. I do remember jumping onto my computer and taking my ad down as soon as the convo ended. I felt like complete crap after that phone call, and I really wondered whether that was a normal discussion for an adult to try and have with a potential child babysitter. Definitely glad I never met this guy. Terrible, terrible vibes just through the phone. It was weird. This happened when I was 19, almost 10 years ago. I don't like to tell people this story because 1, I didn't really handle the situation correctly. 2, I didn't want to look stupid at the time. And 3, I genuinely didn't know what to do about it. So at this time, I was living with my parents. We weren't getting along, so I worked nights to avoid them or hung out with friends until I knew they'd be asleep. I was closing up at work pretty late on a Saturday night. While waiting for my checkout, I go to check my phone, and I see I have a voicemail from an unknown number. The voicemail goes,
"Hey, I'm upstairs in your house right now, sitting on the blue couch next to the weight bench. These gaming chairs are pretty sweet. You really need to upgrade your TV though. Anyway, I'm looking into your bedroom. Come home soon so we can discuss where I'm sleeping tonight."
He had literally described all of the stuff in the game room area of the house, which was right next to my bedroom. I could just feel the color drain from my face, and my manager then asked me if I was okay. I just responded with, "Yeah, I'm just really tired," when in reality, I was just terrified. I deleted the voicemail, and I go to a friend's house to stay the night for a few weeks, and only go home to grab clothes during the day. I continued to get the weird calls from an unknown number for a few months. Sometimes they would hang up as soon as I answer, and other times they ask what I'm doing/wearing. I don't recognize their voice. I even put it on speakerphone in front of one of my friends, asking if they knew who it was, but they didn't. I never had my friends over to my house because my mom and dad are terrible people, so I knew it wasn't one of my friends. I asked my ex-boyfriend about it, thinking he was trying to nurture dependence. He said no, that it wasn't him, but if I wanted to, I could stay with him for a while. I declined. My best guess is it was one of my stepdad's weird friends, thinking that it's some hilarious joke. My parents ended up getting a divorce 4 months after all of this started, so I moved out, and eventually the calls finally stopped. I decided to ask my mom about it pretty recently, and she said she didn't know who it was, but she got really mad that I didn't tell her about it while it was happening. I guess I just didn't know how she'd react. So to that mysterious creepy caller, please don't ever call me ever again. About 10 years ago, when I was around 17 to 19 years old, I would periodically get phone calls from a private number at night. Whoever was calling me wouldn't speak, but I could tell that there was someone on the line by their breathing. This would always happen after about 10 p.m. It would last a few minutes after I'd say hello until the caller or I would hang up. Sometimes I would get really frustrated and say something along the lines of,
"Oh, it's you again.
or
Do you just want to hear my voice?"
they would usually hang up immediately after. Now, you might be wondering why I would still answer these creepy calls. My phone number is a digit away from local police line, so I usually got calls from people trying to reach the police, and I would usually direct them to the correct number. I figured these calls were wrong numbers at first, but after a few months, that was obviously not the case. It didn't really bother me. That is, until one night. I was out with some of my friends around 9 p.m. when I got a call from an anonymous number. I step outside to answer, and I'm greeted with the ever so lovely,
"You freaking hoe,"
etc., etc. I quickly hung up. Now, this wasn't my caller's usual MO. About 20 to 30 minutes later, when my boyfriend and I got back to his place, I started getting call after call, getting screamed at. The person on the line would be screaming, saying they were going to get me, hurt me, you name it. At one point, my boyfriend picks up the phone, and he was incredibly angry and screamed back. He's silent for a minute and just hangs up. Well, at this point, my boyfriend tells me to call the police. The caller then told him that they knew where we were, where I lived, and that he was going to hurt me, along with my family and friends. So now we're pretty spooked and decided to call the cops. We live in a pretty safe town with not much for the cops to do. So the cops arrive and they basically tell us that there's really not much they can do in this situation. It's obviously just a gross prank going way too far. At this point, another phone call comes in. The officer picks up my phone, interrupts their screaming, and then answers with,
Hello, this is the officer. What do you want?
The caller hung up and he didn't call back. After that night, I never got another late night call ever again. It didn't really hit me until a few weeks later that it must have been the same person who had been calling all those times before. I don't really know why they snapped that day and broke their silence. Was it a sick joke? Something more sinister? Were they always angry when they called? I never found out who they were, and I absolutely shudder at the thought that it could be someone I know. So, creepy, angry late night caller. I really hope we've never met or meet in the future. Please stay away. A few years ago, I was watching a movie at my mom's place, who at the time she was staying on site at an animal rescue. The rescue was a house on a couple of acres that had been converted into a rescue. The house itself more or less functioned as a normal home, but the backyard crisscrossed with pens for the animals. There were surrounding properties, but it was kilometers away from the nearest station and very difficult to reach without a car. It was about 9 p.m. post-dinner, and all of the creatures were sleeping soundly in their beds, most notably 2 dogs. These 2 dogs belonged to the owner and had the run of the property, sleeping on kennels on the veranda. They were little darlings once you got to know them, but quite intimidating when you first met, growls and all. Opening onto that same veranda was a laundry that functioned as a second kitchen. As this laundry opened from the backyard, the rescue staff kept the food, dishes, and utensils for the animals' meals in the laundry, rather than tracking muck through the house on their way to the kitchen. Anyway, we're watching the movie on my laptop, about 15 to 20 minutes into You're Next, when someone knocked at the front door. My mom immediately told me not to answer it, but when I asked why, she didn't really have an explanation. My mom has pretty great intuition, but since the dogs weren't going off, I answered anyway. I then swung open the wood panel door, but left the fly screen locked as a concession to her. A soft male voice came out of the dark, the porch light apparently needing replacing. I could make out his height about 5'9", very thin body shape and a beard, and not really much of anything else. He had asked for someone whose name I'd never heard before. When I told him there was no one here by that name, he said that he was waiting for a taxi. But then he said he needed a taxi and asked to come inside to call one. His speech was very meandering. By this time, my mom had joined me by the door, pointing at the window. The door was one of those single panels with glass windows from the door to the ceiling beside it. As we had the lights on inside and it was pitch black night outside, we couldn't see the caller. But he had all of the time in the world to see us. Worried, she gave the caller some directions to a payphone down the street. The caller insisted that he needed to come inside to call a taxi. I insisted he use the payphone instead. He became quite angry and then demanded we let him in. Afraid about being the only ones home that evening, my mom finally snapped and told him she'd call the police if he didn't go away, already starting to dial it on her mobile. Eventually he stopped arguing, and the prolonged silence suggested he was gone. Not wanting to return to the couch, which was in full view of the door's glass windows, as well as from the veranda, we occupied our time in the kitchen just waiting. We then heard another knock on the door. Very nervous, we peered through the glass until we could make out blue and red flashing lights. We then opened the door to 2 officers and started relaying the story. Suddenly, the officer closest to the door then asked, "Is this yours?" We peered around the door frame, and there was a knife laying on the windowsill. A knife that my mother immediately recognized as being used for the rescue animals' meal prep. The officer said from the description it reminded them of a local homeless man who is very well known for drinking far too much and sleeping it off in people's sheds. As such, they were quick to dismiss it as a serious threat, but afterwards my mother and I kept making creepy realizations. That knife came from the laundry in the backyard. How did this stranger get a hold of it without setting off the dogs, or any of the rescue animals for that matter? How long had he been hanging around in the backyard? Was he trying to get to know the animals? Had he been watching us too? What exactly did he plan to do with that knife if we opened the door? I really don't want to know. When I was in high school, I worked as a cashier at a local grocery store. It was a pretty sweet gig because I worked with all of my friends from school, in addition to making friends from other high schools in the area. I mainly just socialized with other high schoolers, but I was always friendly with all of my coworkers, even the older ones in passing. There was one guy that I worked with that would always come through my line to buy things for his break. He was probably in his mid-40s if I had to guess. I would always smile at him and ask how he was doing. He was perfectly friendly and seemed totally normal. I even found out that he was dating one of my friend's mom, which in my mind added an extra sense of security at the time. I didn't pay much attention to people outside of my little world, so it didn't really occur to me that I hadn't seen him at work for a while. Anyway, around this time, I started getting a ton of missed calls from an anonymous number. They would always call me while I was in school, so I never got to answer it. Now, this was back in the day when I wasn't always being bombarded with spam calls like I am now, so these missed calls really stood out to me. The caller never left a message, but the calls always appeared to come in as a barrage. A ton of missed calls in a short window of time. After a couple of weeks of dealing with these private calls, they finally called when I was available to answer after school. I was hanging out with my best friend, and she was already aware of this phantom caller, so we were both pretty excited to put them on blast. I answered the call, and I put it on speakerphone. We were both smiling and ready to troll this caller together. As he began to speak, we both just realized that it was really creepy. I remember the smile falling from my friend's face, and I could feel my own disappear as well. The caller then addressed me by my name. It sounded like a man was sobbing. I asked who it was, and he said it was Tom. I was so uninvested in this guy that it took me a minute to even realize who Tom was. Of course, it was the older man that I mentioned at the beginning of the story. Tom was crying, and he was talking about how he was banned from the grocery store. He then told me that he couldn't step foot on the property. I asked him what happened, and he just went silent really quickly, paused, and then said, "Anyway." It was so dramatic and obviously suspicious that I can still hear the way he said it in my head. It was like straight out of a bad movie how dramatic he was about it. He wouldn't tell me why he was banned, but he said he needed to call me in order to thank me for always giving him my smile and caring about him. He told me that he really missed me, and spoke at length about how beautiful I was. I felt totally sick. I asked him how he got my phone number. What he told me shook me to my core. He said that he wrote it down a while before when I had posted a note on the employee bulletin board offering to pick up other people's extra hours. He had just been holding on to my number. He apologized for scaring me and told me he'd like to keep in touch. I told him that I didn't have his number since he called me on private. Not that I would call him anyway. That was more my ploy to understand why he was calling me on private. He never offered to give me his number. He just said he'd call me back. I think I ultimately ended up hanging up on him out of fear. My friend and I just sat together in stunned silence. He was basically a stranger to me. A grown man crying to me about my beautiful smile and how he missed me. I had several more missed calls over the following weeks, but never reconnected with him. The calls eventually stopped, and of course my phone number has changed a couple of times since then. Oh, and by the way, I decided to confront my friend's mother who was dating him. She said that they had recently broken up because he was crazy, but she wouldn't divulge any further details. Whatever. I just hope Tom stays away from me forever. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you have your own personal scary story, be sure to submit that to my subreddit at reddit.com/r/southerncannibal or to my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new stories. And before we bring this video to a close, I just want to shout out all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 or more patrons featured on screen. Shout out to Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Katrina T, Celeste S, Ellie S, Emily W, Heather B, Howard R, Jazzy G, Jonathan C, Joseph F, Lori J, Matthew B, Michael G, Steph L, Tammy S, Terry H, 2Eki for you, and Victor R. Thank all of you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it more than you know. And if any of you would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thank you everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always stay